So yes, it's very nice to ban Russians from Pornhub, CNN, McDonald's and Coca-Cola, but what do you do about this incoming military disaster? The second problem is that whether the Ukrainians pick option 1 or 2, they will suffer a tactical defeat either by remaining or abandoning eastern Ukraine, and both will lead to important strategic consequences. How the Russians thought the invasion of Ukraine would go, and how it actually went. Hi and welcome to History Legends. Here is the latest update about the Russo-Ukrainian war. As always, if you have any updates, new information, just comment it below. This is the place where we cut the BS and where you learn what's actually going on. And a great thank you to all my patrons for sponsoring this video. Are you ready? Actually, hold on. Let's start with some foreplay before we get to the real stuff. And by the way, all the maps that I'm going to show you are readily available online. It's nothing secret. Just saying. The current situation of the Russian army. Let's be honest, we're witnessing something historic. The invasion of Ukraine is the most important Russian military operation since 1945. And truth is, the mighty Russian army was unable to properly coordinate an operation of this magnitude, as a tsunami of unexpected problems appeared, like poor combined arms coordination and logistical issues, as well as faulty equipment that could perhaps be the result of corruption, where the massive Russian military budget used some pipelines to go straight into the pockets of generals. However, I wouldn't underestimate them either. Here's why. You probably noticed that the Russian offensive stalled in the past few days. And this is why I haven't done a video either. Lots of ceasefires on the front line means ceasefires for me. And we've all seen the videos of the Russian vehicles stuck in the mud. Everyone is laughing. But does it mean that Ukraine has won and we can go back to talking non-stop about the Kyiv? Not so fast. Abandoning stalled vehicles is part of standard practice because the alternative is for the unit to sit still in the open waiting to be dug out of the mud. The only difference is that in NATO armies, the crew would destroy them first. But Russians can't afford that kind of waste. They figure that since they're on the offensive, the units behind them will have the opportunity to recover them. So yes, in the media we see a bunch of Russian vehicles being towed or multi-million-dollar Panzer in the hands of Ukrainians. But in my opinion, that's only one side of the picture. We don't see all the Russian vehicles that are secured and safely brought back to the rear. And even if they truly abandon vehicles. As a reminder, Russia has 12,000 tanks and 26,000 armored vehicles in reserve. Not all of them are operational at the moment. But that is the case for most armies in the world. There is paper strength and real one. What's the most important for the Russians is that the crews are safe. Training people to properly use their vehicle takes many months and sometimes years. In the meantime, some destroyed vehicles can even be repaired, which is easier to be done when you control the ground. The Russians could maybe even reuse some of the Ukrainian equipment left behind, since they basically have the same stuff. What many experts realize is that the Russian army is in a large reorganization process. They are aware that the days for a quick win are long gone, but they're now settling for a siege. One brigade of the 6th Army was sent from the Baltics area to Kharkiv to replace another one sent to Belgorod to be refitted in manpower and equipment. This rotation of units shows us how the Russians are preparing for a prolonged war. So if the Ukrainians simply expected the bear to get tired and leave, they might need a plan B. The Russians also noticed that they needed more infantry. Cannon fodder. Jokes aside, it became apparent that Russian BTGs were heavy on firepower, but light on manpower and logistics. Although it allows these formations to move faster since there are more wheels per human needing to ride on them, they lack the foot soldiers to capture and mop up major urban centers. You gotta see major urban centers like the kryptonite of the Russian army. This explains why Putin called for volunteers from the Middle East and especially from Iraq and the Syrian army to join the Russians. Allegedly 16,000 are on their way to compensate for the current lack of infantrymen of the Russian army, and the Russian government might call for conscripts to fill in the ranks as well. Now, with all this being said, the only way for an army to really know what it lacks is by actually going to war. That's the sad reality. It's similar as to when American armored vehicles first went to Iraq and Afghanistan. They only realized the lack of armor at the bottom of their vehicles once they started encountering IEDs and various explosives. But they managed to adapt and improve. So don't forget that your enemy can also go through the same process. Okay, now what's going on in Donbass? So I found this awesome map which shows the location of all Ukrainian Armed Forces units throughout the country. And surprisingly, it's pretty accurate in terms of the general location of that unit. And with this map, we can more or less predict what the Russians could do next. What worries me is that the media simply talks about sanctions, refugees, sanctions, but ignores the elephant in the room. That is the critical strategic situation of the Ukrainian armed forces in eastern Ukraine. Put simply, in Kyiv, with the enemy at the gates. Got it? The Ukrainian government has a sword of Damocles hanging over its head, which means that the Russian threat on the capital is impossible to ignore. And while the entire attention is turned to Kyiv, UAF forces in eastern Ukraine face unmitigated disaster with severe strategic consequences. Now, the problem for the Ukrainian general staff is the following. If they switch focus and turn all their attention to eastern Ukraine and the perilous situation and send in reinforcements and whatnot, they might lose the capital. And if they only focus on the defense of Kyiv, they might lose a huge chunk of their army. I've been saying it a lot, but as you can see on this map, there are about 8 to 10 Ukrainian brigades stuck in this cauldron. Basically, they're about to get encircled. I'm not gonna go over all NATO symbols, but if you see an X, that is infantry, an X with a circle, that's mechanized infantry, and if you only see a circle, that's an armored unit. Now, wherever Ukrainian defense was the most efficient was when we saw mechanized infantry involved. That leads me to believe that these are among the best trained and best equipped units of the entire Ukrainian army. And the fact that some of the best Ukrainian units might get eliminated from an encirclement is beyond understanding. If you're encircled, you're at the mercy of the enemy. You can't really escape, no more food, no more fuel, no more ammunition, no more anything. Now, the theoretical strength of a Ukrainian brigade is about 3,000 to 5,000 men. Honestly, it's truly frightening when you see the scale of what could happen. That means roughly between 27,000 and 50,000 of the best Ukrainian troops are that close to get eliminated. And the Russians could technically reuse a bunch of material left behind by the Ukrainians. Some say it's a pessimistic view of what's happening, but we need to take a step back of all the emotional aspect of this war and see what's actually happening. And simply look at the maps. Because I can guarantee you that the Russians are doing exactly that. And all this happened because of the Russian breakthrough from Crimea, which was 100% to be expected. Now currently, the Russians don't seem to be strong enough to capture the major city of Zaporizhia. But what they seem to be doing instead is to roll over the right flank of Ukrainian forces across the countryside. The terrain of southern Ukraine is generally drier and less prone to mud. Now, by doing so, they encircled 3 Ukrainian brigades and the Azov battalion in Mariupol. I'm really guessing, but could be a theoretical strength of 10,000 men. That's huge! I don't know how much supplies they have left and how their morale is, but all I know is that they know that nobody's gonna come to rescue them. The Battle of Mariupol is among the most important ones in this war. And according to certain maps, another Ukrainian garrison of unknown strength is encircled at Volnovakha. Now in the north, the Russians have more or less given up on Kharkiv, and they retreated from the outer ring of the city. Remember, major urban centers, kryptonite. Guys with ATGMs can literally hide anywhere and cause massive damage. And they're also so easy to use, Now the Russians decided to bypass the Kharkiv strong points and instead went around the eastern flank towards Izium, where they control about half the city. And apparently a Ukrainian mechanized unit attempted to flank the Russian flanking maneuver, but they were repulsed with heavy losses. And this kind of confirms what Robley was saying, that going on counterattacks in open ground just favors the Russians. For now, the best thing that Ukrainians can do is hold the cities at all costs. So yes, this seems to be the best thing to do, but there's a massive problem with it. It's really not a far-fetched scenario to think that if the Russians squeeze around Kramatorsk while the southern grouping rolls north, all these Ukrainian units will be trapped in open ground. And I'm just thinking how many Ukrainian units have to be sacrificed in encirclements. And this is literally what a French colonel and military historian called Michel Goya was explaining on his Twitter. He said, now the question is, at this point, should the Ukrainian army defend this contact line at all costs while risking getting encircled, or attempt a difficult withdrawal towards the Dnieper and consolidate there? If Ukrainian forces defend the Dnieper, there's only that many bridges across it. They can be easily defended and Russian forces will be forced into a bottleneck situation similar to in the movie 300. The problem is that with every passing day, a withdrawal becomes more complicated. Now he continues by saying the second problem is that whether the Ukrainians pick option 1 or 2, they will suffer a tactical defeat either by remaining or abandoning eastern Ukraine, and both will lead to important strategic consequences. And the last thing he mentioned is the theory of the domino effect. The moment one Ukrainian city falls with all its defenders, all the surrounding Russian troops are now released and free to move on to another siege and clear that one, and so on and so forth. This is why the siege of Mariupol is very strategic, and this is why having all your forces encircled one after the other is a disaster. So yes, it's very nice to ban Russians from Pornhub, CNN, McDonald's and Coca-Cola, but what do you do about this incoming military disaster? And the only way to avoid it is by launching counterattacks, but apparently that's a no-no. So what can they do? And now let's move on to Mykolaiv, another problematic area that started from the Crimean breakthrough. In Mykolaiv, Ukrainian forces not only managed to repel Russian assaults, but they even managed to counterattack and recapture some lost settlements, and somewhat break the siege, momentarily. Now in a way, their stubbornness and active defense of the city really delayed the Russian plan to take Odessa. Now the Russians attempted to encircle the city from the north, but the Ukrainians were very active and stopped this movement. At the same time, social media reports show considerable Russian reinforcement in and around Kherson, most likely intended for Mykolaiv, either by taking the city or bypassing it. And the Ukrainian General Staff warned that Russia could activate its troops located in Transnistria, basically a brigade stationed literally at the rear of Ukrainian forces. Although it is noted that the combat capability and morale of this unit is very low. Now, from what I see looking at this map, it seems certain that the Russians want to take Mykolaiv to secure their left flank. But the unexpected Ukrainian resistance could shift the Russian objectives. They might abandon the drive on Odessa and instead drive northeast towards Zaporizhia from the back. Again, I'm just a guy on YouTube looking at maps. But from what I see, whoever controls this triangle here controls Ukraine. And apparently it's what the Russians are doing at this moment. Some of their vanguard units have been spotted in a village called Novovorontsovka. Now, of course, the Ukrainians have reinforced this sector. But let's look at the worst case scenario. If the Russians really aim for Zaporizhia, they could attack the city from both banks at the same time, aka encirclement. And currently the city is not that well defended. Now the worst is, if they capture Zaporizhia, they can move on to Dnieper that's right next to it. And there they're literally at the back of the entire Ukrainian army. And they basically cut the country in half. And once again, it even threatens the Ukrainian troops stationed at Kharkiv. Honestly, losing the area of Kherson was a massive mistake of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. As you can see, there's an entire Ukrainian tank brigade located around Kryvyi Rih. But I think they will have to counterattack eventually. Ukrainian forces can't just let the Russians roam freely across the country and let themselves get encircled again. Now let's look at what's happening in Kyiv. Kyiv is the capital of Ukraine, and before the war had a population of 3 million people. Remember the formula: massive urban center plus many Ukrainian soldiers equals kryptonite. But let's take a look at what's happening in the northeast. You have 4 Ukrainian strongholds: Ortyrka, Sumy, Konotop, and Chernihiv. By now you're probably familiar with some of these names. If the Russian flanking maneuver east of Kharkiv worked, Ukrainian forces managed to halt the one on the western flank of the city. And in a way, this is why I think the Russians simply abandoned Kharkiv as an objective. Currently, too much resistance and they can't even encircle the city. So that's good, that's an active defense. In Sumy, I heard that most civilians managed to leave the city through a humanitarian corridor. These strongholds are important because when you look at the map, you see all these red arrows right in front of Kyiv. But the tip of the arrow only represents 1/3 of Russian forces. The remaining 2/3 are spread out from that up until the siege of Sumy. And since the countryside is not secured, or not fully secured, that means that Russian supply columns going from Sumy to Kyiv can be constantly harassed by Ukrainian guerrillas armed with ATGMs like the Javelin or the British NLAW, and we've already seen their devastating effect. Every day that Sumy and Chernihiv hold is an additional day to reinforce Kyiv. Now, Kyiv is the center of the Ukrainian defense, and it shows because the Russians have not been able to push inside the city. They're stuck at the outskirts and they're facing heavy resistance. For example, you can see this footage of a Russian armored tank column getting under fire of very precise Ukrainian artillery fire. And here are images of Russian soldiers under heavy fire from Ukrainian forces also around Kyiv. And it seems that every push forward is met with heavy resistance. Now, according to British and US intel, the Russians will launch their massive assault on Kyiv on Sunday. Apparently, the morale of the Russian forces is very low, and perhaps the more they wait, the worse it gets. Honestly, I don't know, maybe by the time you watch this video, you'll have the answer. But personally, I don't think the Russians are ready at the moment to launch their general offensive on Kyiv. They don't even have enough infantry, and they don't want to reiterate Grozny 2.0 by sending massive armored columns headfirst into a city. Like many have said, for now the Russians are setting up their operating bases around Kyiv. And since they're working towards a siege, they're going very slowly. They have no point to rush. And it seems that they're working on securing the flanks and the rear of their position. At the same time, they want to push south to complete the encirclement of the capital. Now again, it's not a secret. I'm pretty sure the Ukrainian general staff is well aware of the current situation. And they're fighting with everything they have to avoid this encirclement from happening. Now let's talk about the arrival of the International Legion, which the Ukrainian government claims to be 20,000 strong from 52 countries. Will certainly boost the morale of the defenders, as many of these foreign volunteers have some military experience already. For example, The Times reported over 150 former British paratroopers who served in the war in Afghanistan had joined and were traveling to the front line. This is all I have for you guys today with the latest information. Let me know what you thought of my analysis in the comment section below. And if you're new to this channel, don't forget to like and subscribe. And once again, 1,000 thanks to my patrons for sponsoring this video.